So today on the podcast, we continue our story of Disney legend Mary Blair. In Disney circles, there are a set of features that, in terms of Mary's involvement, are often called the Big Three. The three were her contributions made the most significant difference in creating the final film. These are also the features that did the most to bring the Disney studio back to profitability after the war. These films are Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, and Peter Pan. Last week we looked at the development of Cinderella, particularly how Mary's artwork for this feature was among the most personal in her Disney repertoire. Some of the isolation she felt moving to New York surely influenced the sense of isolation and confinement that permeates her set of concept images for Cinderella. Today we'll look at Alice in Wonderland and also explore how Mary's contributions were essential to bring that story from an idea up to an actual feature. That is, we'll take a look at what Mary did with the Alice material to turn it into a Disney feature, overcoming many of the struggles and challenges that had stymied previous Disney artists and story teams working on this same material. In fact, Disney had tried to put this material forward as a feature multiple times, but was unsuccessful. That is, until Walt gave the material to Mary and a new set of story artists, and they began to work on it in the late 1940s. We'll also take a look at the growing friendship and sense of mutual admiration that was developing more between Walt and Mary during these years. But before we get into all of that, I need to thank another round of Bandcamp subscribers, as these here are the people who keep this whole podcast going. Each week this podcast takes many hours to assemble, but beyond that, many of these stories, especially the longer ones like Mary Blair, require specialized research and travel, typically to access one-of-a-kind materials in various private or public collections. In our Mary Blair series, for example, it took years to assemble and arrange the material, with much of that coming from a range of sources: archives, special collections, universities, museums, private collections, and so on. And of course, to conduct interviews, nearly all of which required travel and on-site visits. Beyond that, there are the usual costs for producing a show like this. So I am extremely grateful to all of our Bandcamp subscribers as they make this show possible and help preserve and present the history of the Disney studio. Today, a special note of thanks is going out to Kyle, SoCal Jim, Billy, and Brad. Thanks to each of you and to all of our subscribers for supporting this podcast. And now, let's kick over to the show. With Cinderella moving into layout and animation, Walt began to focus his pre-production teams on other stories he wanted to adapt to the screen, specifically Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan, both of which had been in and out of development since the late 1930s. As animator Mark Davis explained, many of these things we worked on over long periods of time and then set them aside. In terms of the development of an animated feature, Walt would pick up a project and then hit a creative or financial barrier and put it aside. But Walt also understood that in the late 1940s, shelving complex projects was not a financially viable strategy. As Walt had geared up for Cinderella, he had built up his studio with artists and other professionals to create feature-length animation, a process that required greater skill and specialization than creating short cartoons or package features. This was a critical period for Walt, story artist Bill Peet explained, since Pinocchio, Bambi, and Fantasia had been disappointments at the box office. Cinderella required a large workforce of artists, similar to when the studio had made Snow White. As a result, Walt understood that when story and concept work finished on Cinderella, he'd quickly need to move pre-production artists over to a new project while animators, background painters, inkers, and painters focused on Cinderella. This new project was Alice in Wonderland, an adaptation of a British novel that had been in the works at the Disney studio on and off for almost 2 decades. Back in 1931, Walt Disney had purchased the rights to the famous drawings that illustrated the original 1865 version of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, illustrations created by the political cartoonist John Tenniel. His illustrations were a blend of realism and the grotesque, with elements of whimsy and the absurd. Disney initially wanted to use these illustrations to guide a possible feature version of Alice, though these plans never progressed in part because Paramount was also developing a live-action version of the same story. The project lay dormant for years as Disney finished Snow White and then developed both Pinocchio and Bambi. But in 1938, Walt returned to it, believing that he could make an animated version whose qualities would surpass that of the live-action offering in the 1933 Paramount film. Well, Alice in Wonderland should never have been done in the realistic medium of motion picture, Walt explained. It's better on the stage, but we regard it as a natural for our medium. But Alice was not an easy novel to adapt for the screen. In early Disney features, the protagonist typically finds personal and situational growth in the final act. Snow White relies on herself to eventually overcome the evil queen and find true love. Pinocchio completes a series of challenges to save his family and become a real boy. Dumbo fights bullies at the circus to rescue his mother and become a big-top star. But the story of Alice, at least in the novel, moves the lead character through a series of absurd and humorous situations as she attempts to go home without placing her in dramatic moments that would cause personal growth and lasting change. Animator Ward Kimball would later describe the plot as a series of vaudeville acts with no plot necessarily in the material. Essentially, Alice encounters one unusual or humorous situation after another, without the dramatic moments collectively moving her to a place of personal insight or meaningful change, a shortcoming that now became a central challenge for the story and concept teams. For the story team, the primary challenge was in developing a unified plot to link together the episodic elements that configured the book. The book itself had 2 principal charms: the fascinating illustrations by John Tenniel and the humorous wordplay and political observations in the writing of Lewis Carroll. Walt was keenly aware that an animated feature needed to find new ways to package the absurd whimsy at the center of Lewis Carroll's creation. "I'll tell you what's been wrong with every one of these productions on Carroll," Walt told his story artists. "They have depended on his dialogue to be funny. But if you can use some of Carroll's phrases that are funny, use them. If they aren't funny, throw them out. There is a spirit behind Carroll's story. It's fantasy, imagination, screwball logic, but it must be funny." In the first full Disney treatment, created in the late 1930s, the story team's solution to the episodic nature of Alice was to have key characters return to watch the climactic final scene in which the Queen of Hearts plays croquet against Alice, a game that leads to a trial and a trial that leads the Queen to ordering Alice to be executed. Only in this version, the Queen doesn't humorously spout off the later refrain of "off with her head," but orders Alice to the guillotine, one position near the top of her castle. Once Alice is there, magical straps moving under their own power tie her to the base of the guillotine. Moments before the wide and heavy blade falls, only then, facing a nightmarish death, does Alice finally awaken from her dream, realizing that she is in the garden just outside her home, safe from the difficult nonsense of Wonderland. Working alongside the story team, the lead concept artist for this version of Alice was David Hall. As the studio owned the rights to the Tenniel drawings, he focused on those as a starting point to create a series of illustrations, mostly using pencil, ink, and watercolors. Like the drawings of Tenniel, Hall's art was a combination of realism and the grotesque, even to the point of arranging hanging corpses along the stairway that leads to the guillotine. After illustrating the material developed by the story team, Hall's illustrations were photographed individually and placed into a story reel, or what at the Disney studio was called a Leica reel. This reel, like a slideshow with music and some narration, presented a visual overview of the entire film from start to finish. After seeing that early Leica reel, Walt felt the project wasn't ready to move forward in its present form. Though Walt didn't record his reactions, no doubt he saw the story lacked a linear plot. Also, it lacked warm characters with whom the audience might relate. One of the people to see this 1939 overview of Alice was concept artist Eduardo Solafranco. He wrote down his thoughts in a letter. The sketches are splendid, but the script is problematic. The underlying issue, of course, concerned how the story did or did not produce a meaningful character arc for Alice, one that led to a lasting change in her personality, outlook, or living situation. But Walt didn't immediately put aside this version of Alice, as he was still drawn to the source material. This David Hall version was then handed off to story artist Bill Peet and Del Connell. We first worked on the adaptation of Alice, Connell explained, for one full year during 1940 and 1941 at Walt's request. I did lots of storyboards on that, but had to stop when I was drafted in July 1941. Walt likely would have continued work on Alice during the war, except that the studio's creditor, the Bank of America, insisted that Disney cease work on all traditional features not yet moving through full production until the war came to an end and foreign markets reopened to American pictures. The next attempt to shape the Alice material came 4 years later in the fall of 1945, weeks after the war ended, when Walt hired British novelist Aldous Huxley to shape the Alice material into a story suitable for film. Ideally, Huxley would create a new master plot that would then stitch together many of the humorous though isolated episodes in the source material, such as Alice having tea with the Mad Hatter, Alice being questioned by the Cheshire Cat, and Alice trying to placate the ill-tempered Queen of Hearts in a croquet game. At this point, Walt believed Alice, like So Dear to My Heart and Song of the South, might be another film that combined live action with animation. But Huxley's adaptation proved unworkable for a Disney feature. He largely tried to adapt the novel directly into a screenplay, leaving the material without an overarching plot. Nothing came of that, writer Bill Cottrell explained, and the Huxley version was set aside. Again, the Alice project was postponed, but this time with a better understanding of its narrative challenges. For readers, a novel like Alice might be unified by a writer's voice, thematic exploration, or a unique sense of humor. But for viewers, films traditionally were unified by a single plot that linked the first sequence to the last, with the intervening drama causing the main character to grow or mature. In the first scenes of Snow White, for example, Snow White stands at the wishing well and hopes to find true love, a wish that is only fulfilled at the end of the film. Likewise, in the first scenes of Pinocchio, Geppetto wants a son, a desire that is only fully realized when Pinocchio becomes a real boy at the end of the story. In terms of underlying plot elements, or more specifically, overriding longings or desires around which a master plot might be arranged, nothing like this existed in Alice. Alice had no large problems at home or with her family that she needed to mend, Likewise, she had no strong personality shortcomings that she needed to overcome, nor did she have a large yearning that would send her on a quest. That is, she didn't have the personality primed for narrative growth. And so with this, all that happens at the end of the story is that Alice wakes up from her vivid and disturbing dream, presumably to go back to her regular life at home, mostly unchanged. Despite these narrative limitations, Walt was repeatedly drawn back to the material, as the more fanciful episodes in the novel seemed ideally arranged for animation. Animator Frank Thomas explained that the idea of Alice in Wonderland fascinated him. Disney writer Winston Hibbler believed that Walt viewed Alice as a prestige project, a classic work of literary fantasy that would elevate the studio's status as a maker of visual fantasies. I think there were certain classics that Walt felt the public wanted him to make, Hibbler explained. I really think that he made Alice almost out of a sense of duty to the public. Beyond this, Walt understood the economic reality of restaffing his animation studio as he moved back into feature production. To financially support his company, a new feature needed to be finished every year or two simply to pay the bills. The increased staff at the studio necessary for feature production required a higher level of overall income. We needed to make a picture, Bill Cottrell added, and there had been a lot of things that had been developed in the earlier starts, but the overall continuity of Alice wasn't exactly to Walt's liking. In the late 1940s, in addition to reassigning the Alice material to yet another round of story teams, he also brought Mary in on the project, perhaps hoping that her designs would add a deeper level of emotion, warmth, and sophistication to the project as a whole. Mary specialized in creating captivating and sympathetic images of young children. She also specialized in creating colorful and intriguing worlds. For this project, both of these skills would be a strength. Like David Hall before her, Mary initially looked to the iconic John Tenniel illustrations, as his drawings in endless editions had represented the Alice stories for decades. For something like Alice in Wonderland, animator Mark Davis explained, there's an entire cult out there who thinks it's the greatest thing in the world and that John Tenniel's drawings are the only ones for Alice. But after exploring a Tenniel-like approach, she quickly learned that Walt wanted to move in a different visual direction. We did try to work in the technique of the Tenniel illustrations, Mary explained. They're black and white pen and brush drawings with a woodcut tool. But Walt would not let us go completely in that direction. Walt's resistance may have been tied to how deeply David Hall's illustrations had been inspired by Tenniel's visual sensibilities. Though it may have been possible back in the late 1930s for Disney to pivot to an artistic approach that favored the grotesque, by the late 1940s, Disney had established a reputation for creating rounded characters that exuded warmth and elicited sympathy from the audience. That is, at this point in the studio's development, about a dozen years after the release of Snow White, Disney had developed a visual brand centered on identifiable elements and an underlying emotional tone. Each of the Disney features so far, at least in some way, had its own visual style. For example, the minimalistic presentation of Cinderella stood in contrast to the lush tones of Snow White. Likewise, Dumbo embraced comic exaggeration, while Bambi incorporated a more refined sense of realism. But these same features might all be described as presenting a type of elevated, contemporary illustration in which rounded characters were presented with empathy and a sense of emotional depth, a set of global design features that were then individuated into each project. The Tenniel drawings, as good as they were, didn't align with the global design features that identified the Disney studio. Tenniel's art was more focused on humor stemming from the unexpected or the absurd. It was focused on capturing viewer attention through the presentation of the grotesque, and its traditions with fine line work related more to the presentation of biting political cartoons than it did with the personality warmth that Disney tried to create through its own art. With the removal of Tenniel as a prime influence, Mary was freed from the expectation that her drawings in watercolors would adapt the artistic presentation of that illustrator's famous work. She was then able to lower herself down into a space where she could see the Alice material with fresh eyes. At times, Mary included, with a knowing wink, stylistic pointers to Tenniel's drawings. Mary's version of the Mad Hatter, for example, has oversized eyes that gesture toward the grotesque. She also includes some fine line or brushwork in the croquet sequence, again a nod to the fine line work favored by Tenniel. But overall, her approach to Alice quickly became her own, not unlike her approach to Cinderella. With this, Mary's presentation began to unify Alice toward a workable animated feature, both in terms of presentation and story. She settled on a dramatic motif to connect the various episodes in Wonderland, namely that Alice as a character was continually challenged and intrigued by the eccentric, often self-serving figures she met, the dismissive caterpillar, the perplexing Cheshire cat, and the belittling singing rose. But unlike Tenniel's line drawings, which primarily expressed the unlikable if curious personalities of Wonderland's inhabitants, Mary's paintings created engaging backgrounds, spaces that were colorful, enticing, and deeply inviting. Under Mary's brush, the garden of talking flowers became a rainbow of overlapping colors. Tugley Woods became a moon-dappled forest of intriguing shapes. The Mad Hatter's party an endless table of colorful teapots, and the Queen's Garden a playful expanse filled with squares of teal and seafoam grass and surrounded by a boxwood hedge shaped like a heart. If the secondary characters lacked warmth, for example, who would ever want to spend the day with the power-hungry Queen of Hearts? The places where they lived were arranged with an otherworldly sense of mystery and an underlying sense of delight. That is, even if viewers didn't find the secondary characters sympathetic, they might find the colorful world that Mary developed a place that they would like to explore. Unlike her work on Cinderella, Mary's paintings for Alice were mostly created with gouache, a water-based paint that produced bolder, far less transparent colors than watercolors. As gouache was opaque, Mary could paint light colors on top of dark backgrounds, which proved to be important in a world arranged underground. With gouache, Mary could also deepen the intensity of individual tones. In this, her illustrations became a chorus of color, a fairyland comprised of unique shapes and color values. In terms of work for a feature, it was her most color-saturated set of concept paintings, particularly in the backgrounds, since her work in Latin America. But the environment of Wonderland wasn't the only area where Mary improved elements of Alice for an animated feature. She also focused on the characters. At times, Mary's design for Alice reused the visual concept of the Mary Blair child, with its large round head, its wide eyes, and its visible sense of innocence. Alice, arranged as a Mary Blair child, shows up in some early designs, but over months Mary adjusted the age of Alice. In some paintings she appeared 4 years old, while in others 12. Eventually Mary settled on a girl of around 10 or 11, almost surely to allow the character more nuanced and sophisticated expressions and dialogue. This was the perfect age for a character to confront an underground world of beauty and chaos, to have experiences in which she could see the value of social control, but was not yet old enough to exert her will on others. Still, the brief return of the Mary Blair child almost surely reminded Mary of its powerful design. The way it presented an idealized sense of childhood in a simple character. This observation would be something that would stay with her in the months ahead. In the end, Mary reshaped both the characters and the environment. Her character designs were far more visually appealing than those of John Tenniel or David Hall, partially masking the acerbic or self-centered personalities of certain Wonderland characters. But more than that, Mary imagined Alice in Wonderland as a feature focused on world building. The characters, at times eccentric and humorously unhelpful, would be countered with one of the most visually appealing landscapes of any Disney feature, a place that invited viewers to explore its shadowy wonders and colorful mysteries. In many ways, Mary Blair made the Disney version of Alice in Wonderland possible. A decade earlier, David Hall's illustrations for Disney were deeply tied to the line art of John Tenniel, which would have produced a film that was out of step with the moral and visual center of nearly all Disney features. Likewise, Aldous Huxley's treatment for Alice had been deeply tied to Lewis Carroll's episodic writings. Neither of these approaches answered the basic question as to why a movie audience would want to live inside this world or be with these characters for 2 hours. But working from her home in Great Neck, New York, Mary was able to imagine how episodic components in the original Alice stories would fit inside the sensibilities of a contemporary Disney film. Throughout her images, the world of Wonderland is colorful, playful, and inviting. Under her pen and brush, the residents of Wonderland, such as the Mad Hatter, the Cheshire Cat, and the Talking Flowers, took on forms that emphasized their sense of whimsy and play, even though their personalities, as in the book, were mostly self-absorbed. Disney artist Ollie Johnston was aware of how Mary's early work shaped his own animation assignments many months later. I think her stuff helped in Alice, especially with the trial scene, with the cards, lots of that type of design. She could really be used to a certain extent. Joe Grant, who worked on character designs when talking about Alice, put it simply, Mary was a genius in what she did. Through styling both the characters and the setting, Mary Blair, perhaps more than anyone else, allowed the project to move forward toward production. But Alice in Wonderland was far from Mary's only interest in the late 1940s, even in terms of painting. In terms of art, her other significant subject during these years was her son Donovan. Mary documented her family life not so much in writing or photography, but rather in paintings. In the work she brushed out, Donovan was often presented in his playroom filled with toys. He had an electric railroad, a rideable car, a place to draw, and a small punching bag. In multiple paintings, Donovan is holding a stuffed teddy bear and also a prized airplane with a rubber band motor. He is repeatedly shown wearing a red cowboy hat with a thin chin strap. In most every painting, he is looking directly at the person painting him with a closed-mouth smile. That is, he was looking at his mother. Though Mary had staked out part of her career at Disney by developing highly stylized images of young children, those known collectively as the Mary Blair children, in her paintings of Donovan, she never tried to arrange his features into the overly rounded and idealized form of children she drew for Walt. Her paintings of Donovan, somewhat like her work for Disney, are colorful and flat, but in terms of presentation, Mary renders Donovan with far stronger notes of realism compared to her recent works for Disney, picking up some techniques she once used while in the California scene movement. In this, Mary indicated that she understood the artistic difference between the Mary Blair children and her own child. Donovan, as part of her real world, was presented with realistic proportions, often with a small smirk of a smile and dark, questioning eyes. The Mary Blair children, on the other hand, had stylized bodies, slightly oversized heads, enlarged eyes, and facial expressions that communicated unfiltered optimism, hope, and joy. That is, Mary clearly understood these two artistic worlds. Donovan's presentation leaned toward realism. Her presentation of the Mary Blair children leaned toward idealized fantasy, a hopeful vision of childhood that largely existed in her mind, like a beautiful dream for what humanity, under ideal conditions, might someday become. In January 1949, Walt, accompanied by Lillian, traveled again to New York to support the release of So Dear to My Heart. He gave interviews, helped with publicity, and met with trade reporters. Once his work was finished, he again visited Lee and Mary in Great Neck. He spent time with Donovan, now 2 years old, and brought him as a surprise a film copy of So Dear to My Heart to view at home. This was one of the films that Mary had helped to create, though her work on this project had ended years ago. Along with a few friends, the Blairs watched the film and noticed how Mary's watercolors shaped the look and feel of the picture, even those sections presented with live action. It was an evening of celebration, but also one that highlighted the differences between Mary's work and that of Lee. Mary's work shaped films that were viewed around the world, while Lee's work created commercial documentaries and advertisements seen by a far smaller number of viewers. In a thank you letter to Walt, Mary explained, "When you left the house Sunday, Donovan said, 'More Walt, more Lily Lady.' So I guess you'll have to come back. Lee joins me in sending best regards to you and Lily." By this point, Mary knew that she wasn't the only Disney artist living in New York. In the city were a handful of ex-Disney artists, mostly having moved there after the animation strike of 1941 or during the war to find other career opportunities. Mary was simply the only presently employed Disney concept artist living then in New York. Among the Disney alums were Martin Provenson, Aurelius Battaglia, and John Parr, the last of which had been one of Mary and Lee's companions on the first Latin America trip. By 1949, all three of these ex-Disney artists were illustrating children's books, largely under the Little Golden Books imprint. Mary, too, decided to try her hand at this. Though her figure illustrations, due to the lack of depth and roundness, didn't easily translate into animation, this same style of illustration, at least in terms of design principles, was perfect for the printed page. Her first assignment was to provide illustrations for a short book written by Jalolo McHugh called Baby's House. In this book, readers follow a young boy through his day, from playtime to bath and dinner and finally good night. The protagonist of the story was roughly the same age as Donovan, with a large playroom and an endless line of toys. At times, the boy here was painted with his mother in the background. The child, though, with his dark curly hair and enthusiastic blue eyes, looked very little like Donovan. Mary may have been presenting the activities of her son in these paintings, but the figure fit far more with the Mary Blair children than with the images Mary had painted of her own son. In this, she was starting to find that the unique skills she had developed with Disney had value outside of animation. She was trying something that she had studied back at Chenard. She was illustrating work for the page. The book, though, wouldn't be released until the following year. 1949 was also the year that Lee, having found some early success, expanded his business. He moved his offices to the center of New York to be closer to advertisers and TV networks. He rented space at 250 West 54th Street, 4 blocks from Central Park, and more importantly, 2 blocks from CBS and 5 blocks from NBC, the 2 largest networks in America. He started to call his business either TV graphics or sometimes film TV graphics, depending on who he was talking to, as he was now sure his path forward would largely involve the small screen. The additional income, or what Lee believed would be the additional income, led him to look for land where he might build a new house, something larger and more elegant than where he currently lived. He was particularly interested in land near a pond, something that faced the water, something that might remind him of California. As the year came to an end, Walt still had a list of projects on which he wanted Mary to work. These would include both features and short cartoons. That Christmas, Walt sent out a large box of presents for Mary, Lee, and Donovan, a holiday expression far larger than he made to most other longtime studio artists. There were things for Mary, also a pile of toys for Donovan. Shortly after the holiday, Mary sent a note back. "Dear Walt," it began, "I would like to, if I only could, express my sincere gratitude for many things. For most generous Christmas gifts for myself and Donovan, but more, your constant encouragement and confidence. It is a privilege to be your association and your friend." At this point, Mary likely saw her professional life continuing with Disney, perhaps with side ventures into publishing. But there was one more thing that in January of 1950 she was not yet aware of. She had just become pregnant with her second child. This, too, would change her life. I'll be back next week with a new episode. Our plan, at least right now, is to post a show that will play into the July 17th anniversary of Disneyland. But of course, plans can change if it turns out to be a crazy news week. But from doing this show for many, many years, I can tell you that midsummer tends to be the least newsy time for Disney. So here's hoping we're good. There are, of course, some news stories out there that we'll talk about later this month. But the big news cycle typically doesn't kick into high gear until mid to late August, when school is back in session and, more importantly, when executives who likely go on summer vacation are all back at work. So the plan next week is to talk about a person who both contributed to the later development of Disneyland over decades and also to the opening of Walt Disney World. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.